The last self-check in this lesson is about how to graph linear inequalities. When we graph linear inequalities, it's really similar to graphing linear equations, which we went over in a previous video. The big difference is that when it's an inequality instead of an equation, we have to shade the graph, and then we have to either make the line that we're graphing solid or dotted. So let me go over those rules first. If we have just a greater than or a less than sign in my inequality, then my line that I'm using is a dotted line. If it's a greater than or equals to or a less than or equals to sign, then it's a solid line that I'm going to graph with. Then to shade it, and we'll talk about why we shade it, but to shade it, if it's y is greater than or y is greater than or equal to, then we shade above the line on the graph. If it's y is less than or y is less than or equal to, we shade below the graph. So let's go over the first example, and then I'll kind of talk about the shading situation. So the first example is y is less than or equal to 2x plus 4. So let me just draw a blank graph here. And what I like to do on these is just pretend like it's an equation and graph it first, or at least put the points on it first, and then kind of decide where it's shaded, if it's dotted or solid, all of that stuff. So when we graph it, we use the last number first, which is our y-intercept. And so in this case, our y-intercept is 4. So I'm going to put a point at 4. Then that number next to the x is the slope, which is 2. The other way to write it is 2 over 1. So my slope means I go up 2 and over 1. So I'm going to go up 2 and over 1. Or I can even go down 2 and backwards 1 because it creates the same line. So now that we know where the line's going to go, we're going to pay attention to this inequality sign, which is less than or equal to. So when it's less than or equal to, it's like I'm going to point to that one, and then this one, right? So we decided that if it's less than or equal to, from the top, it's a solid line. So the first thing I'm going to do is just draw a solid line through those points. Then if it's y is less than or equal to, from the bottom one, we shade below that line. And so all you'll have to do, it doesn't look great on the iPad. Oh, let's see if we can make it look great. Is just kind of color in or fill in the bottom half or below that line. Now, the reason why we shade these inequalities and don't just leave them as lines is because inequalities aren't exact. If I say that it has to be less than something, then it could be, like, let's say that I said it just has to be less than 10. Well, then it could be 9, it could be 8, it could be 7, it could be 6, it could be negative 1,000. And so us shading is showing every possible solution. So when it's less than, we shade below. If it's greater than, we shade above. And it's just showing you every possible solution that could happen. Okay, let's go through the next example. I'm going to do it right here so that we can see my rules again. And I'm even going to erase the arrows that I did for the first example. Okay, so the second example is y is greater than negative 1/3 x minus 2. So let me draw a blank graph here. And the first thing we're going to do is start with that negative 2. The negative 2 is your y-intercept. So from the origin, I go down 2 and plot a point. Then my slope is the number in front of the x, which is negative 1/3. What that tells me is I'm going to go down 1 and over 3. Or potentially I could go up 1 and backwards 3 just to create that line. So before I draw the actual line, I'm going to consider this inequality sign, which is y is greater than. The greater than sign is right there, and it's also right here. So the top orange arrow tells me that it's a dotted line that I have to use. So I'm just going to, instead of doing a solid line, we just make it a dotted line. And then because it's the second orange arrow, or the orange arrow on the bottom tells me that I have to shade above that because it's I'm sorry. But yeah, I have to shade above that because it's greater than. And so I'm just going to shade above that. And that is what my graph looks like. Okay, let's go on to the third example, which is y is greater than or equal to 1/2 x minus 2. I'm going to draw that graph. And let me erase the arrows that we were just using so we can draw new arrows for this third example. So my y-intercept for the third example is -2 again, which means I go down 2 from the origin. I put a point. Then my slope is 1/2, which means I'm going to go up 1 and over 2. I could do it again. So I have a couple of points. You only have to have really 2 points, but you can make as many points as you want. Then from there, once I have my dots, I'm going to pay attention to this inequality sign, which happens to be right here. And then right, where is it? Greater than or equal? Right there. So the top orange arrow tells me that it's a solid line that I'm dealing with. So I'm going to draw a solid line. And then the bottom orange arrow tells me that I shade above because it's y is greater than. So I'm just going to draw this part and it's shaded above. Okay, last example. Let me do some quick erasing first. Okay. The fourth example is y is less than -5 over 2x plus 4. Draw our graph. So that 4 is what we're going to start with, which is the y-intercept. So from the origin, I go up 4. Then my slope is -5 over 2. What that tells me is that I go down 5 and over 2. I go down 5 because it's negative. So from here, I'm going to go down 5 over 2, which gives me this point. There's not a lot of room to make that second point, so we're going to leave it like that. From here, we're going to pay attention to the inequality sign, which is less than. So that happens to be right here, and it happens to be right here. So the top inequality tells me, or the top orange arrow tells me that it's a dotted line. So we're just going to draw dotted lines. Even if you wanted to draw a solid line and then make some eraser marks, totally cool. The second orange arrow, the bottom orange arrow, tells me that I'm shading below that line. So, sorry, I'm going to shade below it or underneath of it. And that is how we graph inequalities.